Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing okay. Now today we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the brainstem and the cranial nerves. Now as part of this lecture, in the beginning we're going to start with explaining some of the external features of the brainstem. We'll look at the brainstem from the anterior end as well as from its posterior aspects. We'll try to identify some of the gross anatomical features on the prosections of the brain, and that'll actually help you identify those features relatively quickly once we come back to the lab and identify those things on the prosections. As a next step, we're going to be talking about the cranial nerve nuclei. I'll show you the different sensory and the motor cranial nerve nuclei, and then we'll try to understand how the different cranial nerve nuclei contribute to the formation of the different cranial nerves. Lastly, I'll briefly mention the functions of the different cranial nerve nuclei and the associated neuronal deficits which can happen once there is a lesion in those regions where the cranial nerve nuclei are situated. Right, so now here you're looking basically at a prosection of the base of the brain on the left side here, and on the right side you can see the cranial cavity, an illustration showing you the cranial cavity here with the vault of the skull which has been removed. And the reason why I'm actually starting with this prosection and this illustration over here is because I just want to contextualize the location of the brainstem a little bit better. So we'll just see how the base of the brain fits into the cranial cavity, and then we'll see where the brainstem is situated. How is it going to fit into the cranial cavity, and how will it exit through the cranial cavity to enter into the vertebral column. Now, here you can see a sulcus in the at the base of the brain, which is known as the lateral sulcus. This lateral sulcus is going to fit into this bony prominence over here, which is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. So the lesser wing of sphenoid bone is going to hook into the lateral sulcus, separating the frontal lobe in the front and the temporal lobe at the back over here. The frontal lobe here is going to rest onto the orbital plates of the frontal bone. This is the inferior orbital surface of the frontal lobe that's going to rest over here, and the temporal lobes are nicely going to fit into the middle temporal fossa over here. Then behind the temporal lobe, we can see the cerebellum here. See, we cannot see the occipital lobe here because the occipital lobe is actually above the cerebellum, and we're looking at the base of the brain, so the cerebellum is kind of hiding the occipital lobe. The cerebellum is going to fit into the posterior cranial fossa right over here. So occipital lobe technically is not a content of the posterior cranial fossa. It is inside the cranial cavity, but higher above the posterior cranial fossa. In front of the cerebellum, we can see this nice brainstem over here. We can see the pons, which is very clearly visible over here, with the basilar artery running on its anterior or the ventral surface, and we can see the pons continuing down as the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is not really that clearly visible here. These three different parts of the brainstem, the midbrain, pons, and medulla, they are going to rest over here against this bony prominence or this region of the cranial cavity, which is known as the clivus. The clivus is this bony region which is formed basically by two bones. We've got the sella turcica over here, which is part of the body of the sphenoid bone, and then we've got the occipital bone at the back over here. Together they form the clivus, and you can imagine the pons resting against the clivus over here with the basilar artery right in front of it. The pons continues down as the medulla oblongata, which is then going to go down as the spinal cord. And so in the cranial cavity, in the base, we can see a big foramen here, which is the foramen magnum, through which the medulla oblongata is going to continue down as the spinal cord and exit the cranial cavity. And then the spinal cord is going to be running down in the vertebral canal. Now, if we take a mid-sagittal section through the brain, then we can see the medial surface of the cerebral cortex over here. We can actually see the medial surface of the left cerebral hemisphere over here. You can see a C-shaped structure over here on the medial surface, which is one of the largest commissural fibers of the brain. This is called the corpus callosum. Right above it, we can see the sulci and the gyri of the cerebral cortex. Down below the corpus callosum, this is the area where the lateral ventricle is going to be situated, and you can see the thalamus forming the floor of the body of the lateral ventricle. You can't really see the ventricular cavity properly because it's covered over by this sheet over here, which is known as the septum pellucidum. That's the medial wall of the lateral ventricle. Now, once that we have contextualized this prosection a little bit better, now the next question is, where is the brainstem situated? Well, underneath the thalamus, we can see the brainstem over here. The brainstem, we know, has three different parts. This is the midbrain part of the brainstem, which we can see resting resting right underneath the thalamus. Underneath the midbrain, then we can see this bumpy region over here that belongs to the pons. And then the third part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. That's going to continue down as the spinal cord. So you can see that the brainstem, especially the pons and the medulla, these are the anterior relations of the cerebellum. Together, these are going to form the contents of the posterior cranial fossa. And you can also see a ventricular space behind the brainstem over here, behind the pons and the medulla. This is the fourth ventricle. It's a diamond-shaped space. It's part of the ventricular system and is bounded anteriorly by the pons and medulla and posteriorly by the cerebellum. Within the midbrain, which is also part of the brainstem, we can see this extension of the fourth ventricle in the midbrain. That is the cerebral aqueduct, and then cerebral aqueduct is going to open up into this midline space, which is the third ventricle. Now here obviously we can't see the third ventricle because we have cut through that space, but we can definitely see the thalamus and the hypothalamus being the lateral wall of the third ventricle. And we already identified the lateral ventricle here. Here we're looking at the left cerebral hemisphere. So this is the lateral ventricular cavity of the left cerebral cortex. Now here once again you're looking at a mid-sagittal section of the head and neck region, and you're looking at the medial surface of the cerebral cortex, but this time through the eyes of an MRI. So what you can see over here once again is this C-shaped structure, the biggest commissure of our brain, which is the corpus callosum. Above it, once again, you can see the cerebral cortex, and you can also appreciate the invaginations, which are kind of shown dark in color over here. These are the sulci, and the evaginations, or the elevations in between the sulci. These are the gyri. The sulci and the gyri are the hallmarks of the cerebral cortex. Then if you go down over here, we can see the cavity of the lateral ventricle very nicely over here. This is in fact the body of the lateral ventricle, covered over by the corpus callosum at its roof. And then the floor of the lateral ventricle is being formed by the thalamus. You can see that very nicely over here. The thalamus being separated from the triangular hypothalamic region with the help of a sulcus, which is called the hypothalamic sulcus. Underneath that, we can see the brainstem resting over here very nicely. You can see the brainstem being the anterior relation of the cerebellum. The cerebellum and the brainstem together are sandwiching this diamond-shaped region here. This is the fourth ventricle, and you can see the fourth ventricle extending up through the cerebral aqueduct, this region over here, which is the extension of the fourth ventricle in the midbrain. And then the cerebral aqueduct is connecting this fourth ventricle with this space over here, which is the third ventricle. And obviously we can't see that space, as we discussed before as well. The space, we have taken a mid-sagittal section through the space, and we're looking at the lateral wall of third ventricle, which is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Then we can see this bumpy region over here. This is the pons, and we can see the medulla oblongata down below over here. Both the pons medulla are resting against this bony region, which is the clivus, and you can see the medulla then extending down through the foramen magnum as the spinal cord. Right, so here once again we're looking at the base of the brain, and you can see an illustration of the base of the brain on the left over here, and the prosection and a picture of a prosection of the brain showing the base of the brain on the right over here. The brainstem can be seen very nicely over here. So if you start from the bottom over here, this is the medulla oblongata, and you can see that the medulla oblongata is characterized ventrally by an anterior fissure over here in the midline. This is known as the anterior median fissure, which is going to continue down with the spinal cord on the ventral side as well. Then lateral to the anterior median fissure, we've got a swelling over here, one on either side. This cylindrical swelling or elevation is known as the pyramid. And if you remember from your previous lectures on the corticospinal pathway, this elevation, which is the pyramid, is because of the underlying bunching of the corticospinal tract fibers. Then lateral to the two pyramids over here, we can see two further elevations, one on this side and the other one on this side. This egg-like elevation on either side of the pyramid is known as the olive, and the olive is because of an underlying inferior olivary nucleus, Then if we extend a little bit up over here, we can see the pons, and the pons is characterized by these transversely running fibers. These are the pontocerebellar fibers, or the cortico-pontocerebellar fibers, because these are the efferent fibers which are coming from the cerebral cortex entering into the pons. These fibers, they pass through the middle cerebellar peduncle and serve as the main efferents entering into the cerebellum. The middle cerebellar peduncle is therefore created mainly by the grouping together of these pontocerebellar fibers. Anteriorly, we can see a groove over here. This is the place where the basilar artery is going to be resting. The basilar artery is present on the ventral surface of the pons inside the basilar groove and is formed by the union of the two vertebral arteries. The basilar artery then continues up and goes into the circle of Willis, contributes to the circle of Willis. Now, if we go higher up, this is the region where the midbrain is present, and we are actually looking at the two peduncles of the midbrain, which are known as the cerebral peduncles or the crura cerebri. In between the two crura, we can see a little space over here. This is the interpeduncular fossa, and you can see lots of little holes over here. These holes are basically meant for the passage of the little striate branches popping off from the cerebral arteries. Those striate arterial branches are going to pierce through the brain tissue and then go inside the brain and supply the subcortical nuclei. And because of the those vessels piercing through the brain tissue, this region is known as the posterior perforating substance. We can see these anatomical landmarks very nicely on the prosection as well. This is the ventral surface of the brainstem. You can probably appreciate the anterior median fissure over here on the ventral surface of the medulla. Lateral to the anterior median fissure, we can see these cylindrical elevations much more clearly visible on this side. This is the pyramid, and then lateral to the pyramid, we can see this egg-like elevation, which is the olive. This is the region which is basically the junction between the pons and the medulla. And here we can see the ventral surface of the pons very nicely. We can appreciate the transversely running pontocerebellar fibers. This is the area where the middle cerebellar peduncle is going to be present. The middle cerebellar peduncle is actually covering over the superior and the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and so we can't really see those ventrally. Here we can see the basilar groove on the ventral surface of the pons, and appreciate you can clearly see the basilar artery running in the basilar groove, going up over here, giving off branches such as the superior cerebellar arteries and the posterior cerebral arteries, which are going to contribute to the circle of Willis at the base of the brain. The midbrain is not really that clearly shown over here, but you can still see the third cranial nerve popping out over here, which comes from the ventral surface of the midbrain. So the midbrain is going to be a little bit more superiorly situated, and it's probably hiding a little bit to the back over here behind these vessels. And so in this prosection, we can't really see the ventral surface of the midbrain clearly. So in this prosection, we can't really see the ventral surface of the midbrain, such as the crura cerebri. We can't really see those structures clearly over here. Now we've got 12 pairs of cranial nerves which are popping off mainly from the base of the brain. The good thing is that they're present in a sequence. If we start from the front, we'll start with cranial nerve number 1 and we make our way backward down to the medulla where we end up at cranial nerve number 12. So starting from the front over here, this is the first cranial nerve, which is the olfactory nerve, seen at the base of the brain at the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. And we can see that olfactory nerve over here very clearly. Actually, olfactory nerve is Actually, this structure is commonly referred to as the olfactory nerve, but technically it is not a nerve, because what we're looking over here is actually the olfactory tract, and this bumpy swelling in the front is the olfactory bulb. And the reason why I'm saying that this is not an olfactory nerve is because this neuronal structure, which you're looking at over here, is covered over by the meninges, and technically, by definition, the central nervous system is the part of the nervous system which is covered over by the meninges. The actual olfactory nerves are going to be present inside the olfactory mucosa, which pass through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone and eventually bring in that sensory information of smell into the olfactory tract. But we commonly use the olfactory nerve and olfactory tract as interchangeable terminologies, but from an exam perspective, if you get a spot over here or over here, you have to be specific in identifying these structures as olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. Then we go over here to the second cranial nerve, which is the optic nerve. and it's basically an X-shaped structure at the base of the brain. Here, the stem of the X has been cut in the middle, so you can only see the posterior extensions of that X. Here, this part over here in the center, this is known as the optic chiasma. The two anterior limbs of the X would be the optic nerves, and these two posterior extensions would be the optic tract. We can see that X over here fairly nicely. You can see the optic nerve over here, one on either side. You can probably appreciate that X over here. See, these are the two posterior extensions of the X. These are the optic tracts and the optic chiasma in the center over here. The optic chiasma is the region where the optic nerve fibers, the ganglionic nerve fibers, are going to decussate. We're not going to go into the details of the decussation right now, but for now, what you have to know is that the decussation, or the crossing of the optic nerve fibers, which are coming from the nasal regions of the retina, they cross over here. Then if you go down over here to the region where the midbrain is present, this is the area where the third and the fourth cranial nerves are going to pop out. The third cranial nerve is the oculomotor nerve, which you can actually see coming out over here from the ventral surface of the midbrain, in between the two peduncles, and from this region over here, which is the interpeduncular fossa. The fourth cranial nerve is the trochlear nerve, and that is the only nerve which comes from the back of the brain. So we can't really see the origin of that nerve over here, but it comes from the back of the brain at the level where the midbrain is present, and then it takes a long course around the side of the midbrain to eventually come to the front of the midbrain. Then if we go down over here, we can see the pons very clearly over here. This is the ventral surface of the pons, and we can see the trigeminal nerve, which is a fairly big nerve in terms of its diameter, that pops out from the ventral surface of the pons. The trigeminal is a sensory as well as a motor nerve, and provides sensory innervation to the face region and motor innervation to the muscles, such as the muscles of mastication. And we'll talk about that in much more detail later. You can see the trigeminal nerve over here very clearly as well, coming off from the front of the pons. So that is very nicely clearly visible here. Then we go down from the pons at the region where the junction of the pons and the medulla is present, and we can see three cranial nerves popping out from over here in a sequence from medial to lateral. These are the sixth cranial nerve, the abducent nerve, the seventh or the facial nerve, and then the eighth cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve. And we'll talk about these in a bit more detail later. For now, we're just trying to identify these nerves so that you guys can actually identify these structures easily on the spots when you come to the lab to see the prosections. Here, this once again is the region where the junction of the pons and the medulla is present, and the sixth cranial nerve is not clearly visible over here. So it's a fairly thin nerve, so sometimes it can get broken as well. But if you go a little bit lateral over here, see, this is the seventh cranial nerve. So the facial nerve on both sides is relatively clearly visible. Lateral to it, we can see this region here, which is the region known as the cerebellopontine angle. It's an angle between the cerebellum and the pons, and through here you can actually see the vestibulocochlear nerve popping out. If you go from here downwards over here, we can see loads of rootlets over here. These rootlets are kind of present in a more vertical fashion behind the olive, and these rootlets, they belong to the glossopharyngeal nerve. So now we've jumped over to the ninth cranial nerve. See, if you go behind the olive over here in a vertical axis down below, these rootlets, these belong to the ninth cranial nerve. This is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Then down below over here, still behind the olive, we've got the rootlets of the vagus nerve coming out, and then down below here we've got the spinal accessory nerve over here. The accessory nerve has two components to it. It has a cranial and a spinal component. The cranial component originates from the medulla oblongata, whereas the spinal component comes from the spinal cord. It ascends through the foramen magnum, enters into the cranial cavity, and then combines with the cranial component to form one big accessory nerve. Accessory nerve is our 11th cranial nerve. In the prosection over here, we can actually clearly see the rootlets of the glossopharyngeal nerves, but the rootlets of the vagus and the accessory are kind of, broken over here. Then ventral to the olive over here, we can see some rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve coming out. So even on the prosection, if it's hard to identify the nerves, this pyramid This elevation, the olive, serves as a very nice anatomical landmark because if you see rootlets coming off from the medulla in front of the olive, then they always are going to belong to the hypoglossal nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve. Whereas if the rootlets are coming from behind it, then based on the level where they are coming off, they could be either glossopharyngeal, vagus, or the accessory nerve fibers. You can easily differentiate the glossopharyngeal from the abducent, facial, and vestibulocochlear nerve because they are present at the junction of pons and medulla, and they're going to be present in a more horizontal orientation as compared to the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now here you're looking at the posterior or the posterolateral surface of the brainstem. You can see the two big thalamic nuclei at the top over here, and the brainstem can be seen down below here. This region here is known as the midbrain, followed by the pons, which is this region over here, and then followed by the medulla oblongata, which is going to continue down as the spinal cord. Now, if you look at the brain, if you look at the midbrain from the back over here, we can see certain elevations over here. These are the nuclei, which are known as the colliculi. You can see two superior colliculi at the top. This is the superior colliculus on the right. This is the superior colliculus on the left. We can then see two inferior colliculi over here. The colliculi are part of the midbrain. They form the roof of the midbrain, and this region is collectively known as the tectum. The superior colliculus at the top over here can actually be seen connected through a white matter tract, which is known as the superior brachium, literally on the side of the midbrain, connecting it with this elevation here. This is one of the nucleus of the thalamus, known as the lateral geniculate body. So the superior colliculus is connected with the lateral geniculate body with the help of the superior brachium. Similarly, the inferior colliculus is concerned through the inferior brachium with the medial geniculate body, which is once again a nucleus of the thalamus. The superior colliculus is concerned with the vision and is linked with the lateral geniculate body, which also receives the visual information. The medial geniculate body receives the auditory information. It's part of the thalamus, and that auditory information comes in from the inferior colliculus through the inferior brachium into the medial geniculate body. So these are some important gross anatomical features which you should be able to identify on a prosection. Then if you go down over here, we can actually see a cranial nerve popping out from the back of the midbrain. This is the fourth cranial nerve, also known as the trochlear nerve. And trochlear nerve is the only cranial nerve out of those 12 pairs of cranial nerves which come off from the back of the brainstem. All the remaining nerves come from the front of the brainstem or from the ventral surface of the brain. Then if we go down over here, we can see this diamond-shaped region. This is the fourth ventricle. We can see the floor of the fourth ventricle over here nicely because the cerebellum has been taken off, and so the floor is clearly visible. We can see a midline sulcus over here in the floor of the fourth ventricle. This is the median sulcus, and lateral to it, we can see a cylindrical elevation. This is known as the medial eminence, and then on top of the medial eminence, there is further an elevation on top of the medial eminence, which is known as facial colliculus. That might not be that prominent over here, but the facial colliculus is formed because of the underlying sixth nerve nucleus, the abducent nucleus, which is wrapped over by the fibers of the seventh nerve. And together, these two structures, the fibers of the seventh nerve and the abducent nerve nucleus, they create an elevation over here, which is known as the facial colliculus, which is an elevation on top of this longitudinal elevation known as the medial eminence. So these are the structures which are sometimes visible on the prosections when you look at the floor of fourth ventricle. Then the medial eminence is limited over here by a sulcus called the sulcus limitans, and lateral to it we can see a triangular region here. This is known as the vestibular region, and this region is known as the vestibular area because we've got the vestibular nuclei situated underneath it. Then if you go down over here, this angulated ending of the fourth ventricle is known as the obex. Uh, just lateral to the midline over here, down below close to the obex, we can see a triangular region over here. This is known as the hypoglossal trigone, and lateral to it we can see another triangular region called the vagal trigone. The hypoglossal and the vagal trigones have got the hypoglossal and the vagal nuclei resting underneath it, and based on that these regions are named as the hypoglossal and the vagal trigones. Then if you look over here, we're looking at the cut sections of the cerebellar peduncles. See, the cerebellum has been removed and you can see the cut sections of these peduncles over here. The biggest of all the peduncles is this one over here, which is the middle cerebellar peduncle, and you can see it coming from the pons, carrying the transverse pontocerebellar fibers in it. It connects the pons with the cerebellum, and if we cut the middle peduncle, then we can see the superior and the inferior peduncles hiding underneath it. The superior cerebellar peduncle connects the midbrain with the cerebellum, whereas the inferior cerebellar peduncle will connect the medulla oblongata with the cerebellum. Down below over here, this is the posterior aspect of the medulla oblongata. We can see the posterior median sulcus over here, which continues with the spinal cord. Lateral to it, we can see this elevation over here. This is the gracile tubercle because of the underlying gracile nucleus, and this is the cuneate tubercle because of the presence of underlying cuneate nucleus. Both the gracile and the cuneate tubercles containing the gracile and the cuneate nuclei are the cell bodies of the second order neurons of the dorsal column pathway. These are the ascending white matter tract fibers known as the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus on the dorsal aspect of the medulla. The gracile fasciculus is going to bring in the sensation of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination from the lower part of the body into the gracile nucleus, whereas the cuneate fasciculus is going to bring in the same information of vibration, proprioception, and two-point discrimination into the cuneate nucleus from the upper part of the body. Here you're looking at the prosection of the brainstem from the front and from its dorsal or the posterior aspect. If you look at it from the front over here, this is the ventral view, and you can see part of the midbrain still intact over here. These are the two peduncles or the crura cerebri of the midbrain, and you can see the third cranial nerve, which is the oculomotor nerve, coming off from the interpeduncular fossa, which is this space over here between the two peduncles of the midbrain. If you go down over here, we can see the ventral surface of the pons. You can see the impression of the transverse pontocerebellar fibers over here. In between them over here, you can see in the midline there's a groove which is known as the basilar groove. That's where the basilar artery would have been present. And then this is the sulcus, which is actually the junction of the pons and the medulla. You can probably appreciate the pyramids over here, one on either side, and then lateral to the pyramid, this is the area where the olive would have been visible. It's partly hidden behind these nerve rootlets which are popping off in front of the olive, between the pyramid and the olive. And remember, we said that if you see any nerve rootlets coming off in front of the olive behind the pyramid, then these would belong to the hypoglossal nerve. So these are the hypoglossal nerve rootlets. The nerves which pop off from the junction of pons and medulla from medial to lateral are the 6th, 7th, and 8th cranial nerve, but they are not visible on this prosection clearly. Then if you look at the prosection of the brainstem from the back over here, we're actually looking at the diamond-shaped fourth ventricle. See, the cerebellum has been removed from here, so we can see the floor of the fourth ventricle very clearly. This is the posterior median sulcus visible over here, and lateral to it, this elevation here, this is the region where the medial eminence is going to be present. And you can probably see that the medial eminence is a little bit more dilated over here. This is the area called the facial colliculus, and that is because of the underlying 6th nerve nucleus and the facial nerve. So the abducent nerve nucleus covered over by the fibers of the facial nerve, which we discussed before as well. Lateral to the medial eminence, this sulcus is known as the sulcus limitans, and lateral to it, this region is the vestibular area or the vestibular region containing the vestibular nuclei underneath it. Then if you go down over here, this diamond-shaped ending of the fourth ventricle, this part is known as the orbix, and you can probably appreciate two triangular cone-like regions over here, this being more laterally placed, this is the vagal trigone, and this being more medially placed, a little bit more clearly visible on this side, this is the hypoglossal trigone. The hypoglossal trigones contain hypoglossal or the 12th nerve nuclei underneath it. The vagal trigone has got the dorsal motor nucleus of vagus underneath it. Then if you go a little bit higher up over here, we can see the cut section of the middle cerebellar peduncle over here as well. This is where the pontocerebellar fibers come in from the pons, move backwards to enter into the cerebellum. See, the middle cerebellar peduncle has been cut, and that is why we can see the sections of the superior and the inferior peduncle right behind it. In an intact brain, we cannot see, in an intact brain stem, when we look at the middle cerebellar peduncle from the front, we cannot see the superior and inferior peduncles which are hiding behind the middle cerebellar peduncle. Right, so here we're looking at the back of the brain and the brainstem. We can see that the cranial vault has been removed from the back, and you can see the occipital lobes of the cerebral cortex over here. You can see the meningeal partitions of the dura mater here as well. This is tentorium cerebellum, and that is actually forming the roof of this region here, which is the posterior cranial fossa. See, the cerebellum has been taken out, and you can actually see the back of the brainstem very clearly over here. In fact, you're looking at the fourth ventricle, the floor of the fourth ventricle over here. Then this area over here, this foramen here, is the foramen magnum, through which the medulla oblongata is going to go down and continue as the spinal cord. Now, if I just magnify this region a little bit, then you can see the magnified view of the back of the brainstem over here. See, the peduncles have been cut, and you can see the floor of the fourth ventricle. In the floor of fourth ventricle, you can probably appreciate the posterior median sulcus, and you can actually see the two trigones very nicely here as well. The lateral one being the vagal trigone, the medial one being the hypoglossal trigone. This is the area where the obex is going to be present, where the fourth ventricle is ending inferiorly. Now here you can actually see the cranial nerves coming out from the brainstem nicely as well. We're looking at the internal acoustic meatus over here. So this would be the facial and the vestibulocochlear nerve going into the internal acoustic meatus. Then if we go down a little bit over here, we can see the jugular foramen, into which you can see the glossopharyngeal nerve coming in, and then the rootlets of the the rootlets of the vagus nerve coming in as well. And lastly, the accessory nerve, which is coming from the spinal cord, the spinal component of that accessory nerve, entering through the foramen magnum into cranial cavity, also going into the jugular foramen. These three nerves are the contents of the jugular foramen: the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and the accessory cranial nerves. Then we can actually see the hypoglossal nerve fibers over here. They're going to go into the hypoglossal canal, which we cannot see over here. See, the hypoglossal nerve fibers are a bit more anterior to these nerves over here, because these nerves, the ninth and the 10th and the 11th cranial nerves, the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory, they pop off from behind the olive, whereas the hypoglossal nerve fibers, its rootlets are in front of the olive. You can actually see the internal carotid artery. You can actually see the vertebral artery over here as well, and the hypoglossal nerve fibers can be seen kind of winding around that artery. Then if you go down over here, see the medulla oblongata is continuing as the spinal cord, and down below over here you can see the dorsal or the posterior sensory rootlet of the first cervical spinal nerve. You can also see the rootlets of the second cervical spinal nerve at the back over here. Now here let's do a quick recap of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and let's just see which foramina inside the cranial cavity these 12 pairs of cranial nerves are going to pass through to exit the cranial cavity. So as a result, you can see that when the nerve exits the cranial cavity passing through a foramen, it's going to have a part of it which is inside the cranial cavity, which is the intracranial course of that nerve, and then part of it is going to be outside, where it goes and innervates the different peripheral structures, and that'll be the extracranial segment of that cranial nerve. Now we've got 12 pairs of cranial nerves in a sequence popping out from the base of the brain, starting with cranial nerve number 1 over here, going all the way to cranial nerve number 12. The first cranial nerve was the olfactory nerve. This is the olfactory tract and the bulb, and the olfactory nerve is going to be passing through cribriform plate in the roof of the ethmoid bone, and those olfactory nerves are then going to enter into the cranial cavity, where they will pour in the sensory information into the olfactory bulb, and then you can see the bulb and the tract over here. The second cranial nerve is the optic nerve, and that is seen in any prosection of the brain as an X-like structure here. The two anterior limbs of the X are optic nerves. This is the optic chiasma, where the optic nerve fibers from the nasal part of the retina cross over, and then these are the optic tracts at the back. You can see the optic nerve fibers. These are sensory nerve fibers. They are coming They are bringing in the sensory information of vision from the orbit, from the eyeball, and they pass through the optic canal to enter into the cranial cavity. And then after that, we've got the third cranial nerve over here, the oculomotor nerve popping off from the front of the midbrain through interpeduncular fossa. The third cranial nerve, the fourth cranial nerve, which is the trochlear, and the sixth cranial nerve, which is the abducent nerve, they all pass through this little fissure over here, which is not really clearly visible here because the fissure is bounded superiorly by the lesser wing of sphenoid bone and inferiorly by the greater wing of sphenoid bone. So this fissure inside over here, that's the passageway for the passage of the third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerves. Through it, we these then go through this fissure into the orbital cavity to innervate the extraocular muscles. The third cranial nerve can be seen here in front of the in front of the midbrain coming from the interpeduncular fossa. This is the oculomotor nerve. The fourth cranial nerve is this thin nerve over here. It's actually popping off from the back of the midbrain. And in fact, this is the only nerve that comes from the back of the midbrain, and that is going to be then coming from the side to the front where it runs along with the third cranial nerve. The sixth cranial nerve is down below over here, coming from the junction of pons and medulla close to the midline. All these three cranial nerves, they share a common course, and so they pass through the superior orbital fissure to eventually innervate the extraocular muscles inside the orbital cavity. Then we've got the fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, popping off from the ventral surface of the pons, and it's called trigeminal because it has three divisions to it: ophthalmic, which is the V1 division, V2, which is maxillary, V3, which is mandibular division of the trigeminal. And you can see that the ophthalmic, that actually goes along with the cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6 through the superior orbital fissure into the orbital cavity. Hence, the superior orbital fissure is going to be housing four nerves passing through it, four cranial nerves, which are the third, fourth, sixth, and the first part of the fifth cranial nerve. Then down below over here, we are inside the middle cranial fossa. Here we've got a foramen called the foramen rotundum, not clearly shown over here, but the maxillary division of trigeminal, the V2, that's going to pass through foramen rotundum, exit the cranial cavity. Then we've got the foramen ovale over here, or the foramen ovale, through which the V3, or the mandibular division of trigeminal nerve, is going to pass through to enter into the temporal fossa outside the cranial cavity. Then we actually go up above this petrous part of the temporal bone and go behind the petrous part, where we move downwards and we'll come across different foramina. The first foramen which we come across is the internal acoustic meatus. That is the foramen through which the seventh and eighth cranial nerve, the facial and vestibulocochlear nerve, are going to pass through. See, when we studied the cranial nerve, we said that at the junction of pons and medulla, we've got three cranial nerves, 6, 7, and 8, coming off from the junction in a sequence from medial to lateral. The sixth cranial nerve, we said, passed through the superior orbital fissure along with the 3, 4, and the V1 cranial nerves. The seventh and the eighth cranial nerves, which are facial and vestibulocochlear, they pass through the internal acoustic meatus to go to the inner ear region. Then if you go down over here, we've got a foramen called the jugular foramen, and now the cranial nerve number 9, 10, and 11 are going to pass through it. And we can see the 9, 10, 11 in a sequence, more or less in a vertical fashion, popping off from the brainstem behind the olive. This is the elevation called pyramid. Lateral to it, this elevation is olive, and we said that the 9th, 10th, and 11th cranial nerves, which are the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and the accessory nerve, they all come off from behind the olive from the brainstem. The accessory nerve, although, is going to have a spinal component to it as well, which comes from the spinal cord, but still they're going to be situated in a vertical axis behind the olive. In front of the olive, we've got these rootlets coming off. They belong to the hypoglossal nerve between the olive and the pyramid. These are going to pass through the hypoglossal canal to innervate the tongue musculature. So what you can see is that the nerves originate from the base of the brain in a sequence from front to back, and they're going to be passing therefore through the foraminas in a sequence, which makes it easier to remember as to which nerves are going to pass through which cranial nerve foraminas. Now, before we begin to identify the cranial nerve nuclei and understand the formation of the cranial nerves, we need to draw some analogies between different parts of the brainstem and the spinal cord. This will help you understand the location of the sensory and motor cranial nerve nuclei. Now, what you can see over here is basically a section of the lower medulla. In the center, you can see a central canal, which basically represents the ventricular system of the CNS. This central canal inside the lower medulla is an extension of the spinal canal inside the spinal cord. However, as we go up in the upper medulla and in the pons, the central canal that opens up from the back and it expands to form what is known as the fourth ventricle. So the part of the ventricular system inside the spinal cord is basically the spinal canal, whereas if we go up into the brainstem in the upper medulla and the pons, that becomes the fourth ventricle. And if we go further higher up in the midbrain, that is going to change into the cerebral aqueduct. Now we need to understand what happens to the surrounding gray matter as a result of this expansion of the fourth ventricle. We know from our knowledge of the spinal cord anatomy that inside the spinal cord, the spinal canal is surrounded by a butterfly-shaped gray matter. And inside that butterfly-shaped gray matter, we've got two ventral horns, which are motor in nature, and we have got two posterior or the dorsal horns, which are sensory in nature. The ventral horns are derived from the basal plate and the dorsal horns are derived from the alar plate. Now, because of the expansion of the fourth ventricle inside the brainstem, inside the upper medulla and in the pons, what happens is that the basal plate, which was initially ventrally situated in the spinal cord, the basal plate is now going to be ventromedially situated, whereas the alar sensory plate, which was posteriorly situated in the spinal cord, now is going to be displaced laterally and therefore would be posterolaterally situated. Now the basal plate is going to split up into three subcolumns and those would be the efferent columns. These would be the special visceral efferent, the general visceral efferent, and the general somatic efferent column. So all efferent columns are going to be motor in nature. Some of them are going to be general, some of them are going to be special in nature. The alar plate, which is now posterolaterally situated, is then going to split up into four different subcolumns. These would be the general visceral efferent column, the special visceral efferent column, general somatic efferent, and special somatic efferent column. So all the efferent columns are basically sensory. Some of them are meant to receive the general sensations, others are meant to receive the special sensations. Some of them are linked with the somatic sensations, others would be linked with the visceral autonomic sensations. Now, since inside the brainstem there's a lot of decussation of the nerve fibers happening, so what happens because of the decussation is that unlike the spinal cord, where the anterior motor and posterior sensory horns are present, it's one continuous entity in a vertical axis. In the brainstem, because of the decussation, those columns they actually split up into different clumps of gray matter in different places, and those clumps of gray matter are then referred to as the nuclei. These are the cranial nerve nuclei. Some of them are going to be motor in nature, the motor cranial nerve nuclei, and some of them are going to form the sensory cranial nerve nuclei. However, the point which needs to be understood over here is that these cranial nerve nuclei, motor as well as sensory, are almost analogous to the anterior and the posterior motor sensory horns of the spinal cord. The only difference is that here the motor cranial nerve nuclei are going to be more anteromedially situated and sensory cranial nerve nuclei are going to be posterolaterally situated, unlike the spinal cord where the anterior horns are ventrally situated and posterior horns are dorsally situated. Another difference is that these motor and sensory cranial nerve nuclei are not going to be one continuous entity. They have been broken down into different clumps of gray matter, whereas in case of the spinal cord, the ventral and the posterior horns are one continuous entity. Now, this also helps you identify the location of the cranial nerve nuclei. So, generally speaking, when you look at a cut section of the brainstem, you'll see that all the motor nerve nuclei are going to be present close to the midline, whereas the sensory nerve nuclei are going to be situated further away from the midline. And this generalizing principle kind of helps you identify the cranial nerve nuclei easily on the sections. Now here you can once again see a horizontal cut section taken through the brainstem. can see the 7 different columns of the cranial nerve nuclei. We can see the general somatic efferent column over here, general visceral efferent column over here, special visceral efferent column here. These are going to be motor in nature. And then we've got 4 sensory columns. Those are the general and special visceral afferent columns. We've got general somatic afferent and then the special somatic afferent column. Now these columns are situated in a vertical axis all along the length of the brainstem. So if you look over here, see this is a schematic of the brainstem. You can see the thalami at the top, and then you can see the brainstem comprising of the midbrain, pons, and then the medulla oblongata. You're looking at the brainstem from the back over here, and the cranial nerve nuclei, the columns of the cranial nerve nuclei have been overlaid on the back of the brainstem to help you contextualize the location of these cranial nerve nuclei much better. So what you can see over here is that, see the motor cranial nerve nuclei drawn on the left side over here. These are much more close to the midline. So you can see the general somatic efferent column shown in red, and the yellow general visceral efferent column, and the orange special visceral efferent column. They're all present close to the midline. On the contrary, the sensory columns, such as the special visceral afferent, general visceral afferent column, and the blue colored general somatic afferent column, and the purple special somatic afferent column, they are situated a bit farther away from the midline. Just to make it clear over here, the motor and the sensory columns are going to be present on both sides of the midline. However, here the motor columns have been shown on one side, whereas the sensory on the other side, just to help you understand things better and to avoid overcluttering of the nuclei over here. Now, these columns of the cranial nerve nuclei have now been broken up into different clumps of the gray matter, and hence these are known as the cranial nerve nuclei. You can appreciate some of them are motor cranial nerve nuclei, whereas the others are going to be sensory cranial nerve nuclei. And now that we have got a general idea of the locations of these motor and sensory cranial nerve nuclei, we're going to study these nuclei one by one, and we will see how do these different motor and sensory nuclei in different combination result in the formation of the cranial nerves. Now let me just use this illustration of the brainstem as a prototype to fill in the cranial nerve nuclei into this table over here. So now in this illustration you can see the back of the brainstem, the back of the pons, and the medulla oblongata with the cranial nerve nuclei overlaid on it. You can see the sensory cranial nerve nuclei here and the motor cranial nerve nuclei over here. Although this is just for the sake of simplicity, we should know that the motor and the sensory cranial nerve nuclei are situated on both sides of the midline. Now, once we've plotted all the cranial nerve nuclei in this table over here against the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, then we'll be able to figure out which cranial nerve nuclei contribute to the formation of which specific cranial nerve. And from that, we'll be able to decipher what are the functions of each cranial nerve and what potential clinical neurological deficits can be elicited if there is a lesion of a specific cranial nerve or its nuclei. So let me just quickly describe the layout of this table over here. See, in this table, we're going to plot the 12 pairs of cranial nerves over here. Then we've actually divided the table into two halves. The motor cranial nerve nuclei would be plotted over here, whereas the sensory cranial nerve nuclei would be plotted over here. The motor half of the table has been divided into 3 columns, and it has been color coded so that it can match with the colors of the cranial nerve nuclei over here. We're going to plot the general somatic efferent motor column over here. We're going to plot the autonomic general visceral efferent column over here, and we're going to plot the special visceral efferent motor column over here. Then similarly for the sensory half of the table, that has been split into 4 different columns as well. And we're going to plot the sensory nuclei on this side in these 4 columns in such a way that the general and special visceral afferent nuclei would be plotted in these 2 columns, color coded in green, whereas the general somatic afferent column, color coded in blue, would be plotted over here, and the purple special somatic afferent column would be plotted over here. Now, as a first step, let's fill in the cranial nerves into this column. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. We've got olfactory nerve, which is our first cranial nerve concerned with the sense of smell. Then we've got the second cranial nerve, which is the optic nerve concerned with the sense of vision. Then we've got the third cranial nerve, which is oculomotor nerve, destined to control the extraocular muscles of the eye. And then we've got fourth cranial nerve, which is the trochlear nerve, which also innervates the extraocular muscle, specifically the superior oblique muscle. We've got the trigeminal nerve, which is the fifth cranial nerve. That's a mixed sensory and motor nerve, and provides sensory innervation to the face and motor innervation to the muscles of mastication. The abducent nerve is the sixth cranial nerve, once again for the extraocular muscle innervation. Then we've got the facial nerve, which is the seventh cranial nerve, and we've got vestibulocochlear, which is the eighth cranial nerve, which has two subparts to it, a vestibular and a cochlear part, concerned with the balance regulation and hearing, respectively. Then ninth and the tenth cranial nerves are glossopharyngeal and vagus. Then we've got accessory nerve, which is the 11th cranial nerve, innervating trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles. And lastly, we've got the 12th cranial nerve, which is the hypoglossal nerve, providing motor innervation to the muscles of the tongue. Now let's take up this red general somatic efferent column first. This column includes the cranial nerve nuclei, which are basically innervating the structures which are under our voluntary control and hence called as the somatic motor nuclei. You can see that these nuclei are present much close to the midline, so naturally they would be innervating structures which are present close to the midline as well, and those two structures would be the eyes and the tongue. Now, the first nucleus over here, this is the oculomotor nucleus, which is present in the midbrain at the level where the superior colliculus is situated. So basically in the upper half of the midbrain. So we're going to put that oculomotor nucleus over here in front of the oculomotor nerve. The second nucleus is the trochlear nucleus, which is also present in the midbrain, but in the lower part of it at the level where inferior colliculus is present. So we've got the second general somatic efferent nucleus positioned over here. That is our trochlear nucleus. The third nucleus, which is in this column over here, this is the abducent nerve nucleus, which is a nucleus of the sixth cranial nerve, which I'm going to put over here. That's also a general somatic efferent nucleus. And then the last general somatic efferent nucleus is this long nucleus here in the medulla oblongata, which is the hypoglossal nucleus. And I'm going to put that over here in front of the hypoglossal nerve. So see, we're building up the functions of the different cranial nerves slowly and gradually now. Now we know that the oculomotor nerve contains at least one nucleus over here. The trochlear nerve contains one nucleus here, and the abducent nerve contains one abducent nucleus. Hypoglossal contains one hypoglossal nucleus, meaning thereby that these nerves would be having the neurons, motor neurons coming from these nuclei, traveling through these nerves to eventually innervate certain structures. Those structures are going to be the extraocular muscles and the muscles of the tongue. The abducent nucleus gives off motor neurons, which are going to be traveling through the abducent nerve and innervating a muscle which is called the lateral rectus muscle. The trochlear nucleus inside the central nervous system in the midbrain, that would be giving off general somatic efferent neurons, which would be then popping out of the central nervous system and traveling inside the trochlear nerve. The nerve is a peripheral nerve is part of the peripheral nervous system, so those neurons would be traveling through the trochlear nerve to innervate a extraocular muscle which is called superior oblique muscle. And then the rest of the extraocular muscles would be innervated by the motor neurons coming from the oculomotor nucleus, going through the oculomotor nerve, innervating those muscles. And then the hypoglossal nucleus in the medulla would be giving off general somatic efferent neurons, the motor neurons, which travel through the hypoglossal nerve and then innervate the muscles of the tongue eventually. Now we're going to take up the second column, the yellow column over here, and plot the nuclei in this column into this table over here. So one thing which you have to know about this yellow column is that all the nuclei present in this column, they are autonomic nuclei. So the motor neurons coming off from these nuclei would be autonomic neurons innervating some visceral autonomic structures. So the first nucleus here is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is present in the midbrain, and this is a nucleus of the third cranial nerve. So I'm going to put that over here, which means now that the oculomotor nerve has two nuclei so far. One of them is the oculomotor nucleus. Its motor neurons are innervating a somatic structure, which are the extraocular muscles, and the other nucleus is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Its motor neurons, which come off from this nucleus, they would be autonomic neurons. They would be traveling again through the oculomotor nerve, but they would be innervating some different structures, such as the constrictor pupillae muscle of the iris, causing constriction of the pupil, which is known as the miosis, or innervating the ciliary muscle, causing the contraction of the ciliary muscle in the eye and helping the lens become globular and therefore contributing to accommodation for the near vision, with the help of which you are able to read a newspaper, look at something really closely, make notes on your notebook, and stuff like that. The second autonomic motor nucleus, which you can see here, is the superior salivatory nucleus. This is a nucleus of the facial nerve, so I'm going to put that over here. So this nucleus is going to send off motor autonomic neurons, which are going to travel through the facial nerve and its branches and eventually innervate the salivary glands, which include the lacrimal gland for the tear production and the submandibular and sublingual salivary gland for production of saliva in the oral cavity. Then we've got the inferior salivatory nucleus here, which is also in the pons, but it's a nucleus of the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is our ninth cranial nerve. So I'm going to put the inferior salivatory nucleus over here. The motor autonomic neurons which pop off from this nucleus, they travel through the glossopharyngeal nerve and they innervate the parotid gland. Then lastly, we've got the dorsal motor nucleus of vagus over here, and it's a nucleus of the 10th cranial nerve. So I'm going to put it over here in front of the vagus nerve. And the motor efferent neurons, which are autonomic motor efferent neurons, which pop off from the dorsal motor nucleus of vagus, they're going to be traveling through the vagus nerve and innervating different autonomic structures such as the smooth muscles of the foregut and the midgut. Now let's take up this third column, the orange column, which contains motor nuclei which have been derived from the branchial arches, and hence these nuclei are known as the branchiomotor nuclei. These are the special visceral efferent category of the motor nuclei. The the first nucleus shown over here is the trigeminal motor nucleus, which is in the pons, and I'm going to put it over here. The trigeminal motor nucleus is the motor component of the trigeminal nerve. It's going to give off motor neurons, which are going to travel through the trigeminal nerve and innervate different muscles, such as the muscles of mastication. Then we've got the facial motor nucleus over here, which is another special visceral efferent category of nucleus. Its motor neurons pop off from the facial motor nucleus in the pons. They travel through the branches of the facial nerve to innervate the muscles of facial expression. Then we've got a long nucleus over here, which is called nucleus ambiguus. The motor neurons which come off from it travel through different nerves, including the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and the rostral part of the accessory nerve. And hence I've put this one big large nucleus in front of these three cranial nerves. For instance, the motor neurons coming off from this nucleus ambiguus, they would be traveling through the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve to innervate the muscles of the larynx and the pharynx. So hence you can see over here we're slowly and gradually building up the nuclei in the table, and we're trying to understand the functions of the different cranial nerves. For instance, as an example, if we pick up the facial nerve, so far we know that the facial nerve has two motor nuclei. The superior salivatory nucleus giving off the autonomic motor fibers which travel through the facial nerve and innervate lacrimal gland and submandibular and sublingual glands. And we've got the facial motor nucleus, which is also a nucleus of the facial nerve. Hence, its motor efferent fibers are going to be traveling through the facial nerve to innervate the muscles of facial expression. So we're trying to understand the function of the facial nerve based on the neurons coming from different nuclei running through the facial nerve. Now let's just take up the sensory part of the table over here. So we're going to start with this blue nucleus over here, which is the general somatic efferent nucleus. And when I say general somatic efferent, what I mean is that all the sensations which are general sensations, which means the sensations which could be perceived in any part of the body, such as the sensory information of vibration, proprioception, pain, temperature, two-point discrimination, they're going to be poured in to this nucleus over here. Now see, this nucleus is so big that it can be broken down into its three compartments. We've got a mesencephalic part of that nucleus, which is inside the midbrain. The proprioceptive information from the face enters into this nucleus. Then we've got the main sensory nucleus here in the pons. The information of two-point discrimination and vibration that enters from the face into this nucleus over here. Then we've got the spinal trigeminal nucleus over here, which is long enough to enter a little bit into the spinal cord as well, and hence it is known as the spinal trigeminal nucleus. The sensory information of pain and temperature from the face region enters into this nucleus over here. Now don't confuse this nucleus with the dorsal column. The sensory information of vibration and two-point discrimination from the face enters into the main sensory nucleus over here, whereas the same sensory information of vibration, proprioception, two-point discrimination from the body that travels through the dorsal column and enters into the gracile and the cuneate nuclei. Eventually, the same information from the body or from the face travels to the thalamus, where it is relayed over here. However, even in the thalamus, it is segregated in a way that we've got two nuclei inside the thalamus, the VPL and the VPM nucleus. The ventral posterolateral VPL nucleus receives the information from the body, whereas the VPM nucleus receives the same information from the face. Then we've got an then the spinal trigeminal nucleus over here that receives the pain and temperature information from the face. That is analogous to the spinothalamic tract of our body, which receives the pain and temperature information from the body and conveys it to the thalamus. Once again, the pain temperature information is going to be segregated in the thalamus, with the VPL receiving the pain and temperature from the body, and the VPM nucleus would be receiving the pain and temperature information from the face through the second order neurons, which come off from the spinal trigeminal nucleus and then land up on the VPM nucleus inside the thalamus. So see, now we are slowly and gradually trying to understand the function of the trigeminal nerve. For example, we can see that the trigeminal is now a mixed nerve because it has motor as well as sensory nuclei. And now we know that the trigeminal nerve has four different nuclei to it. Three of them are sensory, one of them is motor. The motor nucleus gives off motor nerves, which gives off motor neurons, which travel through the trigeminal nerve and then innervate muscles of mastication, whereas the trigeminal nerve also has sensory neurons traveling through it, bringing sensory information from the face, and then those neurons are going to relay that information to the specific nuclei inside the CNS. And from here, the sensory information is then going to go up to the thalamus. Now let's take up the special somatic efferent column, which has been shown in blue over here. That comprises of vestibular and cochlear nuclei. There are four vestibular nuclei and two cochlear nuclei. Vestibular nuclei are concerned with the regulation of balance, whereas the cochlear nuclei are concerned with the hearing function. And these belong to the eighth cranial nerve, which is the vestibular cochlear nerve, and so I've put that over here. Lastly, we've got the nucleus of Tractus solitarius, which is shown in green over here. It's a long nucleus, and we can divide it into two halves, an upper rostral half and a lower caudal half. The upper rostral half is concerned with the special sensations, and the sensory information of taste comes in over here. And so I've put the nucleus of Tractus solitarius over here against the seventh, against the ninth, and against the 10th cranial nerve, because the sensory information of taste from the tongue is carried by three cranial nerves, or by neurons running in three cranial nerves. Those are the facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves. The sensory information of taste from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is carried by the neurons in the facial nerve, which relay that taste information into nucleus of Tractus solitarius. The sensory information of taste from the posterior one-third of the tongue is carried by neurons running in the glossopharyngeal nerve. They relay the taste information once again into nucleus of Tractus solitarius. And then the sensory information of taste from the back of the tongue and from the oropharyngeal area, that is carried by neurons running in the vagus nerve, which bring in sensory information of taste into the nucleus of Tractus solitarius once again, all in the upper part of nucleus of Tractus solitarius. That information is then relayed to the thalamus, because every sensory information eventually has to be relayed to the thalamus. The lower half of the nucleus of Tractus solitarius is the cardiorespiratory nucleus, and I'm going to put it over here in front of the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve, which serve as the afferent and the efferent limb of the cardiorespiratory reflexes. So now you can see that we've plotted all the cranial nerve nuclei, motor as well as sensory, in front of all the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And if we know the functions of these nuclei and we know which cranial nerve they are contributing to, then we can describe the function of a cranial nerve. For instance, if you want to take up the cranial nerve 7 or the facial nerve, for example, we know that the facial nerve has three main cranial nuclei. It is a mixed nerve because it has motor as well as sensory cranial nerve nuclei. And there are different types of neurons running in the facial nerve. Some of them are motor, some of them are sensory. The motor neurons running in the facial nerve, they are coming from the facial motor nucleus, and they innervate the muscles of facial expression. The motor neurons coming from the superior salivatory nucleus are autonomic, and they innervate the lacrimal and submandibular sublingual salivary glands. And then there are sensory neurons running in the facial nerve. These sensory neurons bring in the taste information from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, and these sensory neurons inside the brainstem relay the taste information to the upper part of the nucleus of tractus solitarius. Right, so just to do a little recap over here, we studied the gross anatomical features of the brainstem in this lecture. Then we jumped over to the cranial nerve nuclei. We described the functions of each of the cranial nerve nuclei, and we plotted those cranial nerve nuclei, sensory as well as motor, in front of the respective cranial nerves. And now we're in a position to use the table and the picture as our reference and to be able to describe the functions of all the cranial nerves, and we would be able to understand the deficits which can happen if there is a lesion in each of the cranial nerves. I hope you benefited from this lecture. If yes, then please do like the video and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much, and bye for now.